So, Albo and friends are coming to save us all from ourselves in classic Big Daddy Labor government style. That is when they're not outright banning, say, less harmful tobacco alternatives or implementing some of the world's harshest COVID lockdowns. In this case, they're attempting to control the media, more specifically social media. And before we paint a picture of where this sentiment comes from and the sort of ideology behind most, if not all, attempts to control the flow of information, I think we should quickly read through this article from The Guardian and get an idea of exactly what's being proposed, because there has actually been a draft copy of this legislation released. So unlike the voice referendum, we have a pretty good idea of exactly what's about to go down. So why is Labor's bill on combating disinformation so controversial? From The Guardian. The coalition is ringing alarm bells about the legislation, despite it containing many Morrison-era proposals, but they're not alone in their concerns. By Amy Ramikis. It's been designed to combat misinformation and disinformation on digital platforms, but the Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, original title, exposure draft has unleashed a flurry of controversy and its fair share of misinformation. So what are the facts around this legislation? Will it end freedom of speech in Australia? Starting with the most extreme of the concerns there. Well done, Guardian. What is the bill? The government is seeking to amend the Broadcasting Services Act 1992 by proposing to give the Australian Communications and Media Authority, ACMA, more powers over digital platforms when dealing with content that is false, misleading, or deceptive, and where the provision of that content on the service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. The Communications Minister, Michelle Rowland, said ACMA will be given new information gathering and record keeping powers to create transparency around efforts by digital platforms to respond to misinformation and disinformation on their services. And this is key, while balancing the right to freedom of expression, so fundamental to democracy. Under the proposal, ACMA would be given the powers to register an enforceable industry code if the platform's self-regulation measures prove insufficient in addressing the threat posed by misinformation and disinformation. Importantly, the bill does not give ACMA any takedown powers. No, presumably those powers would be from the social media companies who the government is leaning on. It cannot order the removal of a post. Instead, if concerns are raised, it can ask the platform about its self-regulatory processes, and only if they are deemed insufficient can next steps be taken, including potential penalties and the enforcement of a mandatory code of conduct. The legislation sets out the next steps as graduated increases of power. Interesting. ACMA must give the platform every opportunity to respond to concerns before moving on to penalties. How did we get here? In 2017, the then Treasurer, Scott Morrison, ordered the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, to conduct a review of digital platforms with a focus on the impact of digital platforms on the supply of news and journalistic content, and the implications of this for media content creators, advertisers, and consumers. In its final report in 2019, the ACCC recommended a digital platforms code to address the risk of deliberately misleading and harmful news, including appropriate responses to address disinformation and malinformation. A voluntary code of conduct was drawn up by some of the major platforms in response and adopted by Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, TikTok, Redbubble, Apple and Adobe in 2021. ACMA was given the job of keeping an eye on how the platforms upheld the code. That same year, the watchdog reported to the Morrison government its concerns over the rise of disinformation and misinformation online and recommended beefing up the code. In March 2022, just before the federal election, the Morrison government responded to ACMA's report and promised to boost the regulator's powers. Now, this is in the context of the Liberal Party flailing badly in the polls and basically doing anything they can to get the media and the people off their back in a forlorn attempt to be re-elected. We know how that went. The coalition went to the election vowing to give ACMA new regulatory powers to hold big tech companies to account for harmful content on their platforms. That included providing ACMA with reserve powers to register and enforce industry codes or make industry standards. In June, after the election, Labor said it was looking at digital platforms. In January 2023, Rowland announced plans to do much of what the coalition had planned in regards to beefing up the regulator's powers. Much of what the coalition had planned. What had the coalition planned? This is just Michelle Rowland's. Nice link there, Guardian. An exposure draft of the proposed legislation was released in June 2023, which included many of the same elements the coalition had taken to the election. By July, Sky News commentator Peter Credlin had declared it an assault on freedom of speech, which would establish a Ministry of Truth. Claire Chandler, a Liberal senator, labelled it a threat to democracy. One Nation and other right-wing identities began to campaign against the legislation on the grounds that it would cancel freedom of speech. Not sure how you cancel it or impede, but anyway. In August, the Australian Christian Lobby claimed the bill would lead to the cancellation of Christian posts and announced it would campaign against the legislation. Later that month, the Shadow Communications Minister, David Coleman, said the bill should be torn up and would suppress legitimate free speech in Australia, despite the coalition once promising the same legislation. Could that be misinformation there, Guardian? Because they are not proposing the same legislation at all. It covers many of the same areas, but you got to be careful. You got to be careful. You don't want ACMA to step in and give you a little nudge towards a mandatory code of conduct. Is it only conservatives? No, and obviously not. While there have been many responses to the consultation process after campaigns by One Nation and former Nationals MP George Christensen, there have also been concerns raised by the Human Rights Commission and the Australian Law Council. They're not exactly right-wing think tanks. Those concerns are largely centred around what they say are the broad definitions of disinformation and misinformation in the bill. Content could be considered misinformation if it's false, misleading, or deceptive, which, depending on where you sit, could be just about anything. And the provision of content is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. Cause or contribute to serious harm. Disinformation includes a similar definition, but with the added clause of addressing whether the person or foreign power disseminating or causing the dissemination of the content intends that the content deceive another person. That's a fairly high bar. Establishing intentionality is always difficult. There are exemptions, including if the content is considered entertainment, your Jon Stewarts and your Chasers, parody or satire, obviously, is from a professional news organisation, convenient for The Guardian and other newspapers, is produced for an educational institution, so that's universities, schools, libraries, or has been approved by Commonwealth or state governments. So let's have a think about that. The government is completely exempt, can say whatever they want. News and media companies are completely exempt. The ABC, Sky News, Channel 9, Channel 7, The Australian, the Herald Sun, all completely exempt. And parody or satire and entertainment, solid grounds for an exemption there. But why on earth would you exclude professional news organisations or the government from a bill combating misinformation? The Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance also has concerns over the broadness of the definition of serious harm, with the exposure draft stating that for harm to be considered serious, it must have severe and wide-reaching impacts on Australians. Let's have a think about that in the context of the war in the Gaza Strip. If it were the case that people were reposting, say, the 40 dead, decapitated, scorched, and raped babies claim, or Israel nuking a hospital with 10,000 people inside, would those claims be considered to have wide-reaching impacts on Australians? There is an Australian Palestinian community. There's also an Australian Jewish community. So I guess as long as there is part of the diaspora residing in Australia, you could effectively apply this clause to news from all over the world. The media union also wants further clarity over who would be considered a professional journalist in terms of the exemptions, given that freelancers can work for themselves. If you don't have the backing of a major media organisation, you're up shit creek by the look of it. We don't know what the final definitions of misinformation or disinformation will be. The University of Technology Sydney submitted to the inquiry that it believed some of the concerns to be overblown, convenient coming from a university that's exempt, but accepted there was a legitimate concern about the enlarged role for ACMA. Now, to be clear, I don't think it matters which government body you were to put in charge of something like this, and ACMA is probably the most logical government department, I guess, to handle inquiries like this. But it doesn't matter. They're people, they're human beings with their own biases, employed and paid for by the government in this case. Someone's got to make decisions about this. It proposed limiting ACMA's information gathering powers to measures implemented to prevent or respond to mis and disinformation, thereby removing any possibility that ACMA could indirectly influence decisions on which forms of content comprise mis and disinformation. Limiting their powers to measures implemented to prevent or respond to misinformation. What other powers would they need to enforce something like this? Is it the end of the world? What a stupid fucking subheadline. The exposure draft, as it stands, is unlikely to be the same bill that is introduced to Parliament, with Rowland indicating she is serious about consultation. The bill cannot force a social media platform or user to take down content. In Australia, only the E-Safety Commissioner has those powers, thanks to legislation passed by the coalition government in 2021. And this is something you got to remember whenever the Liberal National Coalition tells you that they're the party of free speech. They are the party of free speech right up until they have a little bit to gain by completely ignoring the principle. Some of the bills the coalition government passed in its last government, wide-ranging powers to spy agencies in regards to the flow of information and the E-Safety Commissioner. So just keep that in mind whenever they go hard at Labor over proposals like this. Existing content moderation has not affected freedom of speech. Citation needed, Guardian. You have no measurements, no data at all on what the chilling effect of legislation like this has been over time. None. None whatsoever. And dare I say, the last few years, lockdowns and all that sort of stuff may have had quite a big impact on freedom of speech. ACMA has noted that platforms like Facebook have removed thousands of posts under the existing voluntary code, which the government's legislation has sort of strong-armed them into adopting. Voluntary code is an interesting way to put that. This bill creates a dialogue where, if an issue arises, ACMA can converse with the platforms about meeting their own self-imposed code of conduct and, if necessary, recommend that voluntary code be strengthened with the threat of the government enforcing a code of conduct as a last resort. In practice, there's not a lot of difference between those two. Angela Flannery, the Deputy Chair of the Law Council's Media and Communications Law Committee, said many critics of the bill failed to distinguish between freedom of speech and the right to have voices amplified by platforms. Now, while that is true, there is a big difference between being able to speak your mind and having the right to reach other people through social media platforms. You got to remember that these platforms are now, for all intents and purposes, the public square. So if you get unpersoned off the internet, you effectively don't exist. You have no reach. You have your freedom of speech, but that freedom has little consequence in the real world. No consequence even. If you can't be heard by your peers and by your community, that's like locking someone up in a jail, in a room, a padded room, with no sound reaching the outside world and saying, yes, you're still free to speak your mind, but it doesn't matter in that case. You've already lost. The Coalition's 2022 election platform included a promise to create stronger laws to combat harmful disinformation and misinformation online by giving the media regulator stronger information gathering and enforcement powers. Again, the Coalition, at least in their recent guise, are no friends of the principle, at least, of free speech. They talk about it a lot, but as soon as you give this power to government regulators, all that talk of principles means jack. It now calls the legislation seeking to do that an absolute disgrace. And yes, obviously that's them playing a bit of politics. Praise the Lord, we live in a democracy where self-interested politicians can at least oppose the government for the sake of opposition. Coleman told Sky News the existing Online Safety Act could be used in some instances, but that only deals with bullying and harassment online, not misinformation. So what's next? Roland has said she plans on introducing legislation by the end of the year, but there is no suggestion it'll be passed this year. With the Coalition voting no, the government will need to negotiate with the Greens and crossbench in the Senate to have the bill passed. I give you two guesses as to where the Greens sit on this. The Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young has said she wants to see an even stronger bill that would include news organisations. Well, hey, at least she's consistent. The Greens are very far to the left, approaching socialist communist side of the spectrum, so obviously they're in favour of government regulation of just about every area of life. But at least Sarah Hanson-Young is consistent. No exemption for news organisations. Lower House Independent MP Zali Steggall, a Teal MP, Zoe Daniel, have also questioned the blanket exemption. Teal being a nice combination of Green and moderate Liberal. Once upon a time, there may have been opportunities for coalition government between those two, but with someone like Peter Dutton in charge and Tony Abbott being the Conservative standard bearer, good luck. No decisions will be made until the final legislation is tabled. The passage of the bill is not expected to be fast. What is in Parliament House? Giving plenty of time for further consultation. So, that's Albo's proposal. But I think to really complete the picture, we need to go back quite a long way, actually, and fill in a few details here and there, a bit of context. Kevin Rudd, who some of you may remember for being Prime Minister twice, the second time after stabbing our first female Prime Minister in the back, has joined forces with none other than Malcolm Turnbull. Good old Malcolm. Former Liberal Party Prime Minister. And they've joined forces to call for a royal commission into the Rupert Murdoch news empire. Dun, 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 dun. So Malcolm Turnbull lost his job as leader of Australia's right-wing party twice. Both times for trying to drag the Liberals into modernity on energy and emissions regulations. And while Tony Abbott spent his time in Parliament trying to get the government to throw taxpayer money at century-old coal technology, Turnbull came up with something called the National Energy Guarantee, which was effectively saying to power companies, look, we don't care where you get your power, get it from wherever you want. There's a few green funds around. All we care about is making sure the power source is reliable. We want reliable energy supply to Australia. You guys can figure out where to gain emissions. The government's going to keep its fingers out of the rest of that pie. I think it was pretty good policy. And it was certainly the best that right-wing parties that have an almost pathological hatred for anything friendly to the environment. It's the best you're going to get from them for quite a while. Anyway, this is where Rupert Murdoch, or the Murdoch Empire, comes in with a relentless campaign from The Australian, our national newspaper, basically calling Malcolm a secret member of the Greens. He was a green lefty, an environmentalist, or a member of the Labor Party, secretly trying to destroy the Liberal Party from within. He was a plant. He was a turncoat. And this idea was most heavily promoted in The Australian by Chris Kenny, senior writer for The Australian, and he's also one of the crew on Sky News After Dark. And a few years ago, he sued the Chaser Boys. If you don't know who they are, please go and look them up. They're like Australia's Jon Stewart, but back in his prime, and there's like 5 of them. And he also sued the ABC after the Chaser Boys put out this little skit.
Yes, succinctly put.
But these acts do provide fascinating commentary, I find, and when they don't, Sky News has installed an emergency boring pundit fail-safe system.
I think the margin of this change of government is what everyone's interested in, although when you talk to coalition officials and MPs and workers and volunteers, of course...
Smooth. Well done, Sky.
It was a terrible mistake, you know, letting Chris Kenny talk for that long.
I think Chris Kenny does make some excellent points, though, Andrew. Like, for instance, I enjoyed the way it took him almost an hour after Tony Abbott's victory speech to start demanding cuts to the ABC.
They need to actually start to question the $1.1 billion they throw to the ABC, for instance.
You know, I agree. I mean, they've just got to cut ABC funding. I mean, this is a network that broadcasts images of Chris Kenny strangling a dog while having sex.
Disgusting. Worse still, they then handed him over to Channel 9 to feed him to the sharks. ABC, what a terrible network. So juvenile.
Very child. I mean, they've got to
Very
be cut.
vindictive.
Got to be cut. Of course, now, the busiest hacks on the night were the lefty hacks, trying desperately to find some ray of hope in their darkest hour.
The bloodbath that we were expecting in Sydney isn't happening.
It wasn't a bloodbath!
Yes, 100 votes have been counted. That's a small swing to Kate Ellis.
A Labor person wasn't totally screwed after 100 votes!
The endorsement of the Labor government by The Economist magazine.
Labor was endorsed by one overseas magazine!
That we have preserved our federal parliamentary Labor Party as a viable fighting force.
Labor is viable!
We were heading for 0 seats in Queensland. That's not going to happen.
Labor still exists!
Never seen such a bunch of losers so happy with themselves. Slightly pathetic, to be honest.
Labor's pathetic!
Well, that's not spin, that's just true.
It all became too depressing for some lefty hacks.
Oh, poor old...
Whew. Anyway, that's a small taste of the Chaser boys and girls. So after the ABC aired that little skit from the Chasers' The Hamster Decides TV show, Chris Kenny turned that spurn into a full-on documentary on the ABC called Your ABC about how bad and evil and biased the ABC is, and obviously a lawsuit that he ended up winning, or at least walking away with a settlement and apology. So there's obviously a man with fairly little self-awareness, to say the least. Chris Kenny, I'll be remembered as the journalist called a dog fucker who stood up for his rights. Yes, you certainly stood up for your rights. Well done. The extraordinary tale of a News Limited writer who sued the ABC over a silly joke. It's just a silly joke, guys. Come on. And how the case raises serious questions about free speech in Australia. The ABC has capitulated to Chris Kenny. Apologies have been offered and cash will be paid to the News Limited journalist. The Chaser boys are forbidden to mock the ABC's grovelling. News Limited and the national broadcaster's many enemies in government ranks are enjoying a sweet victory. A brief scene in an almost empty courtroom in Sydney on Friday was the last episode in this 9-month brawl over a lame joke. The ABC's lawyers expressed sorrow at the distress the Chaser skit caused Kenny and his family, a skit that was triggered by criticism of the ABC and that falls short of the quality demanded by the ABC's audiences. I don't know, I thought it was pretty good. Got to be able to laugh at yourself, don't you? Kenny also spoke through his lawyers. He assured the court that protecting his reputation was only one of the reasons he sued the ABC. The second, counterintuitively perhaps to some people, was in defence of free speech. Wait a minute. Oh, that doesn't make any sense at all. An associate editor of The Australian, with a perch on Sky Television, Kenny has a loud voice to reply to the Chaser's taunts. Instead, he sued. Late on Friday, he told Guardian Australia, "To the extent that I am remembered for this, I'll be remembered as the journalist called a dog fucker who stood up for his rights." Well, at least that's a unique place in history, Chris. What a jury would have made of the Kenny skit, we'll never know. The last big name to take a joke to a jury was Harry Seidler 30 years ago. At stake was a brilliant, abusive cartoon by Patrick Cook. The architect lost and made a fool of himself. But Seidler didn't have what Kenny has, the brass band backing of News Limited and the endorsement of a Prime Minister. The Hamster Decides Episode 5, broadcast a few days after Abbott's election victory, was all mockery, which was the entire point of the show. The Chaser team mocked the new Prime Minister, the defeated Kevin Rudd, Corey Bernardi, Kerry O'Brien, Peter Harcher of the Fairfax Press, now Channel 9 newspapers, the ABC, Channel 9, Channel 7, and Craig Emerson, who sang. Hapless candidate James Diaz mocked himself. Philip Adams and I starred in a grainy black and white newsreel of Chardonnay socialists fleeing Abbott's Australia, which is technically satire, but also technically not. So this is a man who used his credibility as not only a perch on Sky Television and an associate editor of The Australian, but his credibility as one of Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's former PR guys to basically shit on Turnbull after the fact non-stop while Turnbull was Prime Minister. His key claim being that Australia's too small of an emitter to bother reducing any emissions at all, which is a take we've heard frequently from the right side of politics, which is, if you think about it, is essentially saying only China, India, and the USA, maybe Russia, have to worry about emissions controls because they're the only ones who'd make enough of a difference when acting alone, which lets the bulk of the world off the hook and also guarantees that nothing will be done when we really should be preparing for a warming world rather than trying to stop it happening in the first place. Anyway, Kenny and The Australian, they basically shat on Turnbull every couple of days with an opinion piece. Remember, this is the local newspaper of Parliament House, The Australian, our national newspaper. Nobody else reads it. They basically shat on Turnbull until they could convince Tony Abbott to do a Kevin Rudd and try for a comeback, which he did, called a leadership spill, and ScoMo somehow came out on top of that mess. And anyway, the end result is that Malcolm Turnbull hates all newspapers, all journalists, and literally any piece of noise that comes out of News Corp. The irony, of course, being that having had a campaign run against him in the right-wing press, specifically The Australian, Malcolm Turnbull then flipped on a bunch of his old publicly stated policy positions, and in doing so turned into the very thing Kenny and co were accusing him of being when he was Prime Minister. Like retweeting articles in The Guardian critical of the Libs, publicly backing the voice referendum after doing perhaps more than any other public figure in Australia to turn people against the idea by calling it a third chamber of parliament basically the day after it came out. Malcolm Turnbull did more damage to the Indigenous voice to Parliament than just about anyone else, and has spent the last several months campaigning for it non-stop. So his principles are a little flexible. And there's no... Anyway, do a bit of a Joe Biden there. Moving on. His current, not bugbear, his current cause célèbre, his current thing. Let's just call it a thing. His current thing is a royal commission into the media, basically. But not all the media. Just the media that has vague business ties to Rupert Murdoch, who, by the way, has officially stepped down as the leader of the Murdoch empire. One of his other kids will be running the show now, I can only assume. But he's teamed up with Kevin Rudd, who also had a pretty fierce campaign run against him in The Australian, both times he was Prime Minister. So, lovers scorned. They got a lot in common, I suppose. Turnbull to take over News Corp Royal Commission campaign. Former Coalition Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull will take over from ex-Labor Prime Minister Kevin Rudd as the head of the campaign for a Royal Commission into Rupert Murdoch's Australian media empire. I'm surprised they don't want to expand the terms of that Royal Commission. His empire's not just Australian, he's all over the world. He's a globe-trotter, is Rupert. The man who was Liberal leader less than 5 years ago has urged opposition leader Peter Dutton to distance his party from Sky News to boost its credibility and electability, saying the party he once led had been in coalition with News Corp. Interesting. Turnbull, who will co-chair Australians for a Murdoch Royal Commission, alongside trade unionist Sharon Burrow, there's a lot of right-wing trade unionists, said he would continue to donate to the movement and attempt to influence the behaviour of advertisers in a bid to diminish the media empire's power. And when I say not a lot of right-wing trade unionists, I'm not talking about members, I'm talking about the people who run the unions, because they have an official and intricate relationship with the Australian Labor Party. They share power in many respects. In an opinion piece for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Turnbull and Burrow argue that revelations in the Dominion voting systems case of Fox News' on-air talent indulging former President Donald Trump's stolen election lies justify the rigorous inquiry that only a Royal Commission can bring. So they're using Trump's stolen election stuff in the US and the many lawsuits he could have but didn't even bring in trying to get the election overturned to justify a Royal Commission into just one section of the media, just the right-wing part of the media in Australia. Very interesting. I don't see what they have to do with one another, apart from the fact, ooh, scary Rupert, he's got a finger in both of those pies. The Foxification of Australia won't be halted by piecemeal media reforms that can't pass Parliament until they are signed off by Rupert. That's interesting. I don't think he would have said that when he was Prime Minister. Anthony Albanese ruled out a Royal Commission during the 2022 election campaign, and his Communications Minister Michelle Rowland last July said such an inquiry was not warranted. Pretty sensible, honestly. In an interview with this masthead, the Sydney Morning Herald, Turnbull said Labor could still be convinced to establish a Royal Commission if it lost its majority after the next election and relied on the support of progressive crossbenchers, some of whom support the idea. I don't think that would be a politically wise thing to do. If you're just clinging to power, calling a Royal Commission into the segment of the media that's most critical of you will not get you back the middle ground. But let's be honest, Malcolm Turnbull was never the most politically wise operator in Australian politics. He couldn't even hold his own party together, let alone advising Labor on how to call a Royal Commission. Turnbull says News Corp were a part of the coalition. They were part of the government. I'm sorry, this is hard to say with a straight face. I was an exception in this respect. But my successor, Scott Morrison, was in coalition with them, and Tony Abbott was the same. The self-awareness is just incredible. I'm the only person that escaped from Rupert Murdoch's evil, clawing grasp. You must know how that comes across, Malcolm. You're smarter than that. You're one of the richest blokes in the country. Come on, mate, get it together. Asked if the coalition needed to address this relationship in order to win government again, Turnbull agreed. Shock. In his 2020 memoir, A Bigger Picture, Turnbull claimed fellow media mogul Kerry Stokes told him Murdoch plotted to get rid of him as coalition leader, a claim rejected by spokespeople for News Corp, Seven, and the Stokes family. Stokes is calling bullshit on you. But if by plotted to get rid of you, you mean constantly hung shit on you and sniped at you from the sidelines, yeah, what's the difference? Ahoy hoy, comrade. Big pimpin'. In their column, Turnbull and Burrow argue that the burgeoning Sky-aligned faction is driving moderate voters away from the Liberal and National parties, or encouraging self-radicalisation in order to fit in. And that poses a major problem for our democracy. For the coalition parties, this is a crucial moment. Peter Dutton's office declined to comment. News Corp was contacted for comment. I would have liked to have seen their comment on this article. The Murdoch Royal Commission campaign was created in 2020 after Rudd uploaded a video to his social media channels calling the Australian-born media mogul an arrogant cancer on our democracy, and inviting Australians to sign a petition for a probe into media diversity. Let's think about this. You want more media diversity, and you propose to do that by dragging Mr. Murdoch and his newspapers into line with the ABC and 9 newspapers. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But, alas, it gathered more than 500,000 signatures, including that of Turnbull, and led to Labor and Green senators recommending a judicial inquiry into media concentration. Now that's one thing, because it's not focusing on a specific company. Quite another thing to target one company with the power of government, particularly a company that's critical of you. In February 2021, sparked by Rudd's push, News Corp Australia's executive chairman, Michael Miller, rejected his opponent's key claim about the extent of News Corp's ownership of media outlets, arguing the industry was a picture of diversity, not monopoly. A former Prime Minister's objections to News Corp, who then mobilised his social media followers, is in a large part why we're here. Australians for a Murdoch Royal Commission was initially created with funding from the Victorian Trades Hall Council, but relies on micro-donations from the public. In August, the organisation said it had 43,000 members based on email sign-ups. Email sign-ups? I don't know if that counts as a member. Rudd announced on Sunday he was stepping away from the organisation he helped found to take on his new role as Australia's ambassador to the United States, which I have a feeling is the role he always wanted. He was always a bit of a diplomat at heart, not a politician. He kind of sucked at being a politician, like Turnbull. Strange bedfellows. I am immensely pleased with the appointment you will be announcing this week. Immensely pleased. Oh, they're buds now. Rudd wrote in his resignation letter. You are building a seriously formidable team, and it is reassuring to know the campaign will be well led in its next phase. The most important campaigns are never won easily. Correct. They're very difficult, particularly when half of the media is constantly shitting on you. You have to break through the noise and convince the public that you're worth a crap. Turnbull, not so great at that. Turnbull said he believes public figures were fearful of raising questions about defence and national security matters such as AUKUS because they worried about being labelled unpatriotic by the Murdoch press. It's not the general public's problem that you don't have the spine to publicly proclaim your beliefs and philosophies and ideology. What an unbelievable cop-out. Oh, I don't want the bloody Australian and all 400 people who read it to think I'm not for Australia. There's a remarkably arid debate, and I think that's because people are intimidated by the right-wing media. Yeah, put it in safety terms, and you'll immediately get a few more people onto your side. Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, who has led the Greens advocacy for the probe, said she hoped Turnbull's appointment would foster bipartisan support. Good luck for the campaign, which would stem largely from progressive voters rather than Liberals, because Liberals are not interested in getting their claws into private media companies. The ABC is another story. There's a lot of liberals who have some weird sort of obsessive fetish about the ABC, but private media companies, liberals will universally say, leave the hell alone, get the government out. They don't say that, then they're not really a liberal, in name or in title. The Parliament cannot continue to ignore the calls across the country for a royal commission into the Murdoch media mafia, she said. Well done, Senator. Well done. So just because all our fantastic, well-meaning, pure-of-heart politicians treat The Australian as the Parliament House School newsletter does not mean that anyone else in the country reads the damn thing. These are the circulation stats of Australia's big newspapers. Now, obviously, digital readership has changed a bit in the last 5 years, so these numbers are on the low end. They'll probably have 2 or 3 times these figures digitally. Yeah, between 100 and 500% more digital readership than in paper readership. I don't have a citation for that. But for a newspaper that's completely paywalled, as we see here. Yep, nope. Logged in? Yep. What about breaking news? Can we go back? No, paywalled. Opinion. Ooh, voice vote exposes a rift that has been evolving for years. Oh, the right-wing rag. Anyway, it's all paywalled, as you can see. 88,000 people in a country of nearly 25 million people read The Australian in 2018. And if we look at these figures, that has been dropping every year. There is no paper read by fewer people than The Australian anymore. Maybe the Canberra Times, that being a local paper. NT News, I'm not sure is still around. The Mercury. But most of these papers now focus on their digital efforts. So keep in mind, The Australian also costs up to nearly $2 a day. It's one of the most expensive newspapers in the world. It just does not have the power it once did. No newspapers do. And the only people who really think that it does are those who subscribe to the Noam Chomsky propaganda model of communication, or don't have a fantastic grasp on how individual actors form opinions in the social media age. Unbelievable. Oof. Yeah, I'm surprised Biden's still alive, honestly. The Australian is so expensive because it is the newspaper that all of our politicians read. There's a copy on every politician's desk in Canberra, and I've been there and I've seen it. It is, I don't know if you can tell without actual access to the articles, but it is a very Canberra and Parliament House focused newspaper. It focuses very heavily on the business of government, the relationships between individual politicians and the parties. It doesn't get bogged down in, footy or bloody tennis or sport or that sort of stuff. It's got a very good foreign affairs department. I was subscribed to The Australian for nearly 10 years because it's beyond the commentary section, which is very heavily, I wouldn't say right-wing, but very socially conservative. Very socially conservative, and by that I mean Chris Kenny, socially conservative. Oh, shit. Janet Albrechtsen, very socially conservative. PVO, not so much. Bit more centrist. Bit more liberal in the true meaning of the word. Paul Kelly, liberal with conservative leanings. Frank Brennan is, I believe, a former pastor who is socially conservative. So their commentary page is very conservative, not liberal. But the rest of their journalism is really top-notch. There are, without a doubt, campaigns run against individual actors in Parliament House in Canberra, but the quality of their journalism, once you account for, the stories that they will cover as a right-wing paper and the bits that they'll leave out, and you can fill in the blanks with things like The Guardian, which is written by a bunch of student unionists, and The Age, which is written by a bunch of sort of inner-city green liberal types. The picture you get of what's going on in the nation's capital is excellent through the Australian. So that's one thing I will say for it. That's why it is so damn expensive, because I think they can get away with it because its subscribers will be very high income, very highly educated, and very city-centric. Ben Shapiro's company, actually, the Daily Wire, has a very good grasp on how a media company can not just operate but grow in the social media age. They're a new company and they already have some of the biggest reach of any media organizations on specific social media platforms like Facebook, News Limited, News Corp. The Murdoch Empire does not. Their digital presence, their presence on social media outside of comment sections on their own articles, I can't fucking read anything, is shit. You would expect it to be with the head of the company, what's he, pushing 90, 100 years old now? News Limited, News Corp rather, is just not a relevant, powerful player in Australian politics, particularly in the manner that its critics paint it as. Malcolm Turnbull thinks, a campaign is run against me in the Australian, therefore everyone else is reading something Chris Kenny published and voting against me because of it. Not true. Most Australians the Australians that do read papers, read state-based papers. Almost no one reads The Australian. The Herald Sun, actually, is Australia's most read newspaper, I believe. We still there? Yep. 220 for the Daily Telegraph in Sydney. 300,000 for the Herald Sun in Victoria for the city of Melbourne. It's the most widely read newspaper, and its whole thing is footy, 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 footy. It's a Victorian paper, so of course it's all about AFL. No probs, comrade. No probs at all. It's an interesting conversation. Happy to have it. So let's briefly cover what the propaganda model is. Just to get an idea of what some progressives like Friendly Geordies are thinking of newspapers like The Australian and media companies like News Corp, because it leads to people that subscribe to that model dismissing a hell of a lot of quality journalism out of hand immediately just because it comes from a news source, from a paper that they don't like. They're not a fan of. So, got a little article here. The propaganda model of media control, introduced by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky in the book Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media. Worth a read. Studied it in university. It's an interesting book. The theory states how propaganda works in mass media. The model tries to understand how the population is manipulated, how the social, economic, and political attitudes are fashioned in the minds of people through propaganda. Herman and Chomsky mostly concentrated on American population and media for their research, but this theory is universally applicable. It kind of has echoes of critical theory in that regard. In the book Manufacturing Consent, Herman and Chomsky say a propaganda model focuses on this inequality of wealth and power and its multi-level effects on mass media interests and choices. It traces the routes by which money and power are able to filter out the news fit to print, marginalise dissent, and allow the government and dominant private interests to get their messages across to the public. According to the theory, media operates as a business. Well, that's not a theory, that's just the reality, which sells its products, readers and subscribers, to other business entities that do their advertisements in media rather than performing the function of disseminating news for the public. That is true. The thing that they sell is eyeballs, and their customers are advertisers. The same thing for social media companies. It's the same thing for all media companies. Here the news is being misshapen and reformed from its original form. Herman and Chomsky call the factors which misshape news filters. And there's 5 of them. The news... For fuck's sake, come on. There we go. The news is being filtered by each of these factors before it reaches its audience or the general public. So, the 5 filters. Let's go all caps. Funding. Oh, that's not the first one. Size, ownership, and profit orientation of mass media. Fuck, couldn't have given me a soundbite for that one. Ooh. The major media organizations are in the hands of a few elites. The major news channels, newspapers, and other mass media instruments are part of large corporations and conglomerations. The information presented to the public will be varying as per the interests of these organizations, which is true for literally every organization in existence. As a part of maximizing profit, they sacrifice news objectives. That is a bold claim. The extensive financial interests of these organizations may endanger the quality of news. It is common around the world that the media is in the hands of government being puppets. Guess you'd be talking about Al Jazeera there. Example, corporate organization who owns media never publishes the financial details because those details may endanger them. So they'll sacrifice news objectives to protect parent company. Claim 1. Funding. The advertisements play the major role of funding in mass media. If advertisements were not funding mass media, the price of newspapers may include cost of its production, and also it's applicable for other mass media like television, radio, and electronic media. This is not the most well-written summation. Apologies. So it's common that the media filters the news in favour of advertisement providers. The ethics of the mass media is often modified for their existence by... What the fuck am I reading? Let's go to the example. A corporate organisation may threaten the media, saying they'll withdraw advertising if the media publishes any news which damage the reputation of the organisation, or, in many cases, we've seen this, damaging their own reputation. That is what we call cancellation. You say something wrong, advertisers pull their contracts, pull their funding, pull their sponsorships, and then you're left high and dry. But funding, specifically, can come from just about anywhere, and it's not limited to advertising as it might have been in Chomsky's day. So I guess you could call that capture by advertisers or paying subscribers. How many of your favourite creators have you seen start pandering to their audience once they get to a certain size? They no longer give you their unfettered thoughts, or rather they do, but those thoughts begin more and more to conform. They move down a funnel towards the overwhelming views of their audience. Number 3, source. Even the biggest media organisations cannot afford to have reporters and cameras persons wherever the news breaks. That's true. There will be some sources for news, and the media is supposed to protect these sources, and in the same time, there will be powerful sources which tend to change the policies of media. For prevailing a continuous flow of news, the media takes suitable actions in favour of those sources. The relationships have to be maintained with these sources, and it is common that news articles are published keeping the source in mind. For example, the spokesperson of a Prime Minister or President is considered as a powerful source of news, like the White House press room. For making sure a proper flow of news, the organisation keeps the sources delighted by fine-tuning the news. This article almost seems like it was translated from another language. So, they're unlikely to publish or push anything that inhibits they're not going to publish a story shitting on their biggest source of information, basically. Kind of like funding. Flack. This was my favourite one. Flack. Refers to the negative responses. Basically, audience revolt. If flacks are produced in a large enough scale, it is destructive to the media. The media will always have an eye for negative responses. It will have a thorough look of the materials and news before it publishes or broadcasts some news about a publicly loved figure. As a filter, it will try to avoid the news which may bring sorts of negative responses. Jesus. For example, most of the media never publishes news projecting a negative image of religious leaders without strong evidence, because it may harm the reputation of the media organisation. We've seen this with, what was the name of the newspaper in France that published a cartoon that made light of certain religious prophets. I don't think we need to go into detail. You probably know what I'm talking about, but you could argue that some news organisations were worried about flack when they were not hiding, but not publishing abuse allegations from the Catholic Church and other child protection institutions in Australia, at least. And number 5, the most important one of all. Goodness me, this article's destroying the language center of my brain. Anti-communism. And this is the one that bothered old Mr. Chomsky the most. As far as the American corporations and elite groups are concerned, communism was the ultimate evil because it took their wealth and power from them. It threatened their superior positions and high class because there were no classes in communist Russia. There were no elites over there. The elites, who are the owners of the media, adopted a policy to bring censorship to articles and news which talks about the good side of communism. Lol. The American elite even feared the word communal, which is true, I believe. This is the 5th filter in propaganda model, suggested by Herman and Chomsky. Note to self. Read more than the first couple of paragraphs when prepping an article for stream. To socialism/communism is 86th. Anyway, so that's the 5 core tenets of the propaganda model. Mr. Chomsky calls them the 5 filters of the news media. But so much of this no longer applies. Apart from completely ignoring the potential for agency you have as a reader, everything that's gone into your life before that point in time, everything you've learnt and everything you've read, you just don't have the freedom to interpret news sources that's flown through these 5 filters in a neutral and unbiased way. At least they don't believe it is possible. That's why it's called the propaganda model of communication. It's more of a theory, but it has a lot of purchase in the harder left, tanky style Twitch streamer community. They love Noam Chomsky, and he's done some good work, but this model of communication has very firm limits. And it's not something you can just point to dismiss journalistic work that disagrees with your ideology. Not if you're serious about a contest of ideas, anyway. So the bottom line is all news sources have it. Before I go into that, the thing is, a lot of this doesn't apply in a social media age either. There's been new media organizations popping up, independent media, a lot of individuals now running their own, I guess, miniature media corporations. Would they call The Guardian subject to these 5 filters, given that it's purely reader funded? What about content creators online that rely on subscription models, that rely on donations, that are all community funded? Like, it's so much of this doesn't apply to so much of the media that is out there in the world today, that I think this model, like the news limited papers, it's less relevant than it has ever been. Bottom line, all news sources have a bias. Every single one. All information is filtered through people, because, and I got to caveat this right now, we're saying this could change with the advent of artificial intelligence and ChatGPT writing some pretty scary stuff. But whether it's someone who works in the press gallery in Canberra or on the ground in Gaza, just because David Spears, who currently works for the ABC, reports or reported for Sky News, doesn't mean the information he presents is just a sop to the After Dark crew who are socially conservative and banging on their pulpits all night, every night, to try and get the evil socialists in Labour out and the communists in the Green expelled from the country. That's not how that works. He's not doing what he does with no other purpose than to manipulate people into voting for the Libs, whether or not he's working for Sky News or the ABC, the public broadcaster. The Herald Sun, which again is the biggest newspaper in the country, has on the whole been very critical of Labor governments, and I might add Turnbull's Libs for decades. And yet, here in Victoria, the Liberal Party has been in power for 11 of the last 41 years. 11 of the last 41 years. So it's been in power for a quarter of the last very, very long freaking time. This is a Labor state through and through, despite the rabidity, the rabidness, the rabies with which the Sky News After Dark crowd went at Daniel Andrews for his harsh lockdowns, despite the Australian pushing the same line that governments were doing too much, going too far, despite the fact that The Age has really lost a lot of its sheen as an alternative to the Herald Sun, and now most people only read that online. So, if the Herald Sun and Rupert Murdoch is an all-powerful puppet master kingmaker, the fact is he's just shit at it. He's shit at it because power is shared very equally in this country, particularly when you consider the fact that you have only one media organisation on the socially conservative side of politics. It might be the biggest media organisation, but you have a plurality of voices that diametrically oppose just about everything that comes out of Murdoch's papers. And so you've got Murdoch papers now being some of the only sources of news with that more conservative or right-wing bent. The Age and Sydney Morning Herald, the former Fairfax papers that are now Channel 9 newspapers, are more centrist, although I guess progressives like our friend Geordie take one look at the board, the CEO, and go, oh shit, fuck, he was in the libs. He was a treasure for the libs. Yes, everything their papers print is just conservative, far right, neoliberal propaganda. No, the whole lot's just misinformation. Dismissed. Even though 9 newspapers to this day have a thorough roster of both progressive and a couple of conservative writers, and then you've got the Guardian and to a lesser extent the ABC, who both feature rosters almost totally devoid of anyone to the right of university student unionists or Twitch tankies. And thankfully for a taxpayer-funded organisation like the ABC, they have an explicit neutrality charter that tempers some of their staff's more progressive impulses. And I don't think this is an inherently bad thing. I think journalists, people who train as journalists throughout university who have those interests, have a natural tendency to be more socially progressive in their outlooks. I think that's just the nature of the profession. It leads people, pulls people in that direction. But you still need to be able to input information from both edges of the spectrum if you want to paint a complete picture. If you want to fill in that entire jigsaw puzzle and not just one half of it, you can just take a look at some of the outrageous shit Laura Tingle says publicly or tweets and deletes, and you get the impression she thinks we'd all be better off in a one-party state with no alternative media and no alternative party. And I don't think I need to provide a source for the claim that that would be shit. But honestly, the contempt some of News Corp's harsher critics have for the idea of voices that directly challenge you and your points of view is very, very thinly veiled. Which brings us back to The Voice. More and more in the wake of the failed Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander voice referendum, we're seeing articles like this, which claim the no vote was an unparalleled act of racism by white Australia. Unparalleled. Worse than the Stolen Generations, worse than the British Empire dumping a bunch of my Irish ancestors on the shore here and giving us the finger. Worse than all of that, worse than the deaths, worse than the horrible state of things in some of these really, really regional communities. A no vote democracy is an unparalleled act of racism. If it wasn't a choice from your perspective, then it wasn't a gracious offer, an outstretched hand, as Albanese exclaimed. It was just an attempt to bloody get your stuff in the Constitution regardless of its acceptance on a democratic level. So I'm going to read this article. Indigenous groups say referendum loss proves Australia is a country that does not know itself. I would argue that any result in the referendum is indeed what the country knows about itself, by its very nature. Central Land Council and ANTAR issue statements after week of silence, with the latter claiming the voice defeat was an unparalleled act of racism by white Australia. No mention of the black sovereign movement there. Indigenous groups have broken a week of silence after the defeat of the voice referendum to express sadness and disappointment, with some describing the no result as an unparalleled act of racism by white Australia. Australians overwhelmingly rejected the proposed Indigenous voice to Parliament on 14th of October, with the highest yes vote recorded in the ACT at 61%, followed by Victoria at 45%. We are the most progressive state in the nation here in Victoria, bar none. Queensland had the lowest yes vote at 31%. After a vow to remain silent for a week to grieve after the vote's results became clear, groups on Sunday shared their dismay, condemning the dog whistling and misinformation of some in the No campaign. The Central Land Council, one of 4 land councils in the Northern Territory, said the referendum result showed Australia was a country that does not know itself. Those of us who have been around for a long time recognise how it feels. What other referendum involving Indigenous Australians has been lost? We have been here before. When? Fact check. Dates and results. State debts, legislative powers, monopolies, railway disputes. Legislative powers, essential services, state debts, post-war reconstruction, social services, rent and prices, powers to deal with communists and communism. Not carried. There you go. Communist haven, Australia. Parliament to increase the number of members. Aboriginals to enable the Commonwealth to enact laws for Aboriginal people. To remove the prohibition against counting Aboriginal people in population counts in the Commonwealth or a state. Carried all 90.7%. And I don't know if there are others. To give a vote in referendums to electors in the ACT. Northern Territory should absolutely have a vote, but democratic elections, local government, parliamentary terms, rights and freedoms, republic. Okay, so very curious to know where the Central Land Council gets this idea that we've been here before. The fact is we just haven't. They're just wrong. And it's coming from a place of hurt. I understand that. But you might call that misinformation. Others in our communities, especially young people, are in shock and disbelief. We need to work together and support each other. We will keep fighting for equality, fighting for land, fighting for water, fighting for housing, infrastructure, good jobs, education, closing the gap, a future for our children. The CLC noted that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders all over remote Australia voted yes. Most, yes, absolutely, but not all. Not all of any group voted yes. That's the problem with this sentiment that white Australia commits an unparalleled act of racism. It's just not true, and you're just lumping several individuals who would have been fighting for your cause as strongly as anyone into a group of people that you don't like. The council said while the outcome was disappointing, it recognised the courage of the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, for bringing the request for a voice to a vote. Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation, ANTAR, said it was deeply saddened by the results but would not back down for voice, treaty and truth, the key aims of the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. Once again, an opportunity to be more than a former colony of the British Empire has been missed, despite a proposition which was so gracious, modest and accommodating to mainstream values. And yet, when it doesn't go your way, the response is unparalleled act of racism by white Australia, don't know yourself, dog whistling and misinformation really crimps the idea that it was gracious or accommodating to mainstream values. We don't accept that this is the end of the movement for change. The voice was only one mechanism for progressing First Nations rights and justice. Absolutely true. The group said many First Nations people felt lost and placeless in their own country. We're hearing that for many, the unfolding events of 14 October felt like an unparalleled act of racism by white Australia. But there are more stories of resilience and resistance of leaders who won't back down. The group said it was clear that dog whistling and misinformation were critical factors. The idea that there were issues with your proposal, with issues with the idea that you should lock it into the Constitution, it's just not even a part of the reality of some of the people in the Yes campaign. 9 newspapers reported on Sunday there had been division among some Yes campaigners. Oh, so it's not just the No campaign. Over the wording of an official joint statement. A draft copy, according to 9, blamed the federal coalition. Interesting. Stating the referendum was doomed from the time that the National Party and then the Liberal Party said they would oppose it and bipartisanship was lost. Yes, bipartisanship is, at least historically, very important in passing referendums, but consider the primary votes of the Labor Party and the Liberal National coalitions in the last couple of federal elections. I think the Liberal National Coalition's down to about 38%. I think the Labor Party's down to about 34%. So roughly, you got a third of the country throwing their lot in with Labor, a third throwing their lot in with the coalition, and a third who probably don't give a shit what either of the major parties think. So I don't think it's the case that bipartisanship is as important for referendums as it once was. I do think both parties should have stayed out of the yes and no campaigns. That would have made it free of partisanship. It may not have been bipartisan, but at least it would have kept partisanship out of the question, as it should be. The parties don't even have a place in the Constitution. They just sneak by, hoping no one notices them. It was reported to have stated, the truth is that the majority of Australians have committed a shameful act, whether knowingly or not, and there is nothing positive to be interpreted from it. Wow. Only the shameless could say there is no shame in this outcome. Well, the definition of shameless would be no shame, but what an incredibly critical reading of the result. That's amazing. I feel a bit sorry for people who think like that. Albanese has so far resisted revealing the government's next steps, but has committed to listening to Indigenous groups. Oh. Wow. So, the claim is that the no vote is an unparalleled act of racism by white Australia specifically, that misinformation and lies played a massive, the central role in its failure, and Albanese and Labor, fresh off of failing to convince the nation to lock this voice policy into the Constitution, which again, for the record, an entirely separate question to the idea of whether or not the voice is a good policy, whether or not you want to put it in the Constitution. But they're using the fact that the only electorates that supported it were highly educated inner cities to suggest the rest of the country fell for a bunch of misinformation, that the no vote is simply a sign that misinformation and false advertising is more prevalent and more powerful than ever. Murdoch probably had his tentacles in there somewhere. And because the reality is in the eyes of Albanese and Labor and a few of the people making these comments, there is no legitimate reason to vote no. There is no legitimate reason to oppose their proposal, despite the fact that it was such a gracious, accommodating and modest idea to put your thing in the Constitution. I was wondering, actually, whether or not Albo would support Zali Steggall's Truth in Political Advertising draft bill, or come up with his own after this voice campaign, and it appears he has come up with his own, but it's a far broader attempt to control the flow of information from the government. Australian Agenda is going to tell us about it.
Free speech is vital for a functioning democracy and for our knowledge to evolve and develop over time. Free speech enables us to critique and criticise the government and hold underperforming politicians to account. Without free speech, people must adhere to government talking points, creating a hollow echo chamber. Without free speech, incompetent and corrupt politicians can thrive. Without free speech...
Let's be honest, incompetent and corrupt politicians thrive anyway. I don't think anyone with a solid heart can make it that far in politics. I think by the time you get to the top, you've already sold out most of what you stood for just to get there.
We cannot challenge the status quo, and our knowledge becomes stagnant. Unfortunately, the Albanese government and the ALP have seen fit to attack free speech through their so-called Misinformation Bill.
Now remember, as the Guardian article we read a while back mentioned, the Coalition they had their own version of this little bill back in their day. They were going to do maybe not exactly the same thing, but it would have been just as chilling on the idea of free speech.
The bill is so egregious that even Human Rights Commissioner Lorraine Finlay has criticised it. In this video, I'll dive into what the bill aims to do and why it is so abhorrent. Now, the goal is evidently to target so-called misinformation on social media platforms. The bill exempts the government, universities and the media from its own provisions.
Government, the media, exempt from misinformation. That alone is it's just baffling. Unbelievable. The hubris involved in exempting the government from misinformation. That's politicians. The government is made up of people. And the people who set the agenda don't have to conform to the same rules as everyone else.
Enabling the government to go out and spread misinformation itself. This should be no surprise, of course, given that Anthony Albanese once flippantly remarked that if he were to become dictator, he would ban social media.
I'll give you the perfect world, okay? You are dictator for 5 years. What do you do?
If I could do something, maybe ban social media.
Not regulate, not clean it up, not let people have conversations, but have the government watching and reading every single one. Just ban it. You don't get to have those conversations unless I'm in the room.
Because why? What worries you about social media?
Look, I think a couple of things. One is keyboard warriors who...
Oh, those keyboard warriors. Got to be careful of those people with keyboards.
Can anonymously say anything at all.
Anonymously say anything at all, which that is freedom of speech, the freedom to say anything, as long as you're not directly calling for violence on other people. Obvious caveats there, but being able to say things anonymously, got to get the government involved there somehow.
So with this in mind, let's look at the bill and why it is such a massive problem. And if you've got any thoughts about it, well, do let me know that in the comments below. So let's start with what the Misinformation Bill aims to do. Well, it effectively would deputise social media companies to go out and take action to suppress and
forces social media companies to monitor, report on, and suppress misinformation.
Eliminate so-called misinformation. The relevant regulator, ACMA, wouldn't it...
The Australian Communications and Media Authority, for those that have just joined us,
itself send jackbooted goons to social media influencers to harass them. Rather, it would get social media companies to do it on its behalf, at least metaphorically. Now, to be clear here, the misinformation underlying this bill is so incredibly broadly defined that there are massive problems, and that's something I will come back to. Now, the way the bill would get social media companies to suppress so-called misinformation is in two ways. First, ACMA would be able to collect and then publish information on misinformation on those social media.
Name and shame. Keep in mind, the coalition government gave similar powers to ASIS a while back, so Albo's not the only one who wants the ability to be anonymous online to not exist. And I think the last Liberal government had a similar issue because these are people that just haven't grown up on the internet. They don't understand the centrality of the internet and particularly social media for Zoomers and some of the younger millennials. They don't understand how much of your identity is formed on there. They don't understand its inherent value in the same way that younger people do. They can't wrap their head around it, and so they seek to control it.
Media platforms. So, for example, if misinformation were rife on YouTube, then ACMA could collect information on that and then publish that information to name and shame those companies. In so doing, it could make the company look less trustworthy and as a result potentially undermine its business model by making it less attractive to advertisers.
I think a lot of these social media companies are pretty good at doing that themselves, but I mean, they're not monopolies in the truest sense of the word, but they have enough of a market share, enough of a user base that advertisers are pretty much forced onto there to sell if they want to sell.
Second, ACMA could force social media companies or bodies representing them to publish codes of conduct to govern the suppression of misinformation. Those codes of conduct could then ultimately become enforceable. If the body or the entity were unable to come up with a code of conduct, ACMA could come in and create one itself. These codes must provide adequate protection for the community from misinformation or disinformation on the services. Now, clearly, if they fail to do so, then ACMA could step in and provide such a code of conduct.
So this would be a social media company is totally deficient if and only if their code is not operating to provide adequate protection for the community from misinformation or disinformation on their services. And again, this is all great feel-good stuff, but for anyone who actually understands how these companies operate, the inevitable result is a chilling effect on free speech, whether by actual regulation from companies like YouTube and Kick and Twitch of the content that is on there before the government gets involved, or the government puts pressure on them, they start banning people, and it's not just a chilling effect, it's actual outright suppression.
ACMA could then require the companies to comply with that code, and if they fail to do so, ACMA could issue them with enforceable undertakings, and if they fail to comply with those undertakings, they could be penalised. and therefore in so doing, ACMA could encourage companies to go out and suppress so-called misinformation. Now at a superficial level, people might
think about how that would have worked in the COVID times when information on vaccines and lockdowns and statistics on transmission and death rates, all this information was so volatile in the first place and subject to change. Health orders themselves had the best information available on which to make these decisions, and they were changing daily in some cases. Now remember, you have the Andrews government arresting pregnant women for attempting to stage freedom rallies outside of the ring of steel that locked down the city of Melbourne. That's a direct implication on freedom of speech. How would you determine misinformation in an era where the information itself changes so rapidly? I don't think it can be done, at least not in any way that maintains the underlying principle of freedom of speech, which we don't have the right to in Australia, like countries like the United States do. The United States Constitution is a seriously fortified document.
be thinking, what's wrong with suppressing misinformation? Misinformation is bad, let's get rid of it. The big problem is how it operates, the types of speech that will be suppressed that are actually real, genuine speech, and the fact that it is so overbroad. So let's go through some of these problems. I'm just picking some of the biggest ones that occur to me. The first one is how you define misinformation. The bill defines misinformation as false, misleading, or deceptive information that, quote, is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. Now, there's actually quite a bit to unpackage there.
For the purposes of this schedule, dissemination of content using a digital service is misinformation on the digital service if the content contains information that is false, misleading, or deceptive. And as we've seen with some of the fact checks during the RMIT fact checks in particular, claiming misinformation or false were themselves outright deceptive or false or misleading. It's a mess, and it's not a mess the government should stick its head into. B, the content is not excluded content for misinformation purposes, so that would be the entertainment exclusions that we covered. The content is provided on the digital service to one or more end users in Australia, so if anyone in Australia can access it. And D, the provision of the content on the digital service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. And serious harm is another one of those things that can be defined as literally anything based on the government of the day. If intercourse between states shall be absolutely free, can be defined by a court as absolutely free unless the government decides there's an emergency, then not absolutely free, then not even relatively free, then serious harm could be such a wide range of shit. Could be anything, really. Which person in your life would you trust to define what constitutes or contributes? It doesn't even have to be the initial cause. Could just be on the back of, it could be on a bandwagon. But if it contributes to serious harm, who are you going to trust to define what serious harm is? Would you define Tony Abbott? Would you trust Tony Abbott to define that? Guy who knighted Prince Philip on Australia Day? Are you going to trust Albo? The guy who thinks pretty much everything is misinformation. I wouldn't trust any of them. I wouldn't trust anyone to tell me that what I'm saying is causing serious harm. No one. Maybe an AI, but we're not there just yet.
Because within all of those components, we have issues. Furthermore, information from government, universities, or the media would be exempt from this.
Exempt. Excluded content for misinformation purposes. Content produced in good faith for the purposes of entertainment, parody, or satire. Again, that is the government's get out of jail free card. That phrase, good faith. who the hell are you to determine whether I'm producing something in good faith or not? Entertainment, parody, and satire is a good exemption. That could have been the entire Clause A. Content produced for the purposes of entertainment, parody, or satire, and it would have been a much better reading. Good faith is just giving them an out, just in case there's something they really don't like. Professional news content. Why? Content produced by or for an educational institution accredited by the governments. So if you run a private school, you're not exempt. But if you're a university or a public school, you're all good. Actually, I guess private schools would, in many cases, qualify as accredited. That's probably just so you can't do a Project Veritas and claim you're a not-for-profit or educational institution or something. But again, why would an educational institution, who you might argue it is more important for them than anyone that they not put out misinformation, this gets that RMIT fact check entirely off the hook. You're in the clear for putting out just crocs of shit, and that doesn't need to be there, that exemption. That betrays a political objective.
And effectively deemed to not be misinformation. I'll come back to that later. Now, at a surface level, the definition sounds somewhat palatable. What can be wrong with suppressing false information, for example? But there are some problems. The bill doesn't define what is false, misleading, or deceptive. False according to whom, and at what time, according to what measures. Misleading according to whom, deceptive according to whom, according to the government, according to a fact checker. Do you trust the fact checkers?
And that's the biggest problem. It's not one you can solve.
There's a whole lot of questions that are really left unanswered. Now, clearly legislation will have a tough time answering those questions, but perhaps in this case legislation should not be stepping into such a contentious area.
That would be my argument, but clearly there's people who are not going to be satisfied until the Murdoch news empire that controls the world is reined in. It's got echoes of its own little QAnon conspiracy theories with, the woke globalists in Hollywood drinking the foreskins of Jewish babies in order to live forever on Jeffrey Epstein's island in heaven.
Now, of course, there are major issues underlying this. The first issue is that this gives rise to enormous power for a cottage industry of so-called fact-checkers, which themselves are not necessarily accurate, not necessarily trustworthy, and not necessarily impartial. We saw this, for example, during the Voice debate, where there were disputed fact-checks put over Peter Credlin's commentary.
Oh, he's pre-watched.
Those disputed fact-checks pertain to how long the Uluru Statement is. There was a live debate about this, because the same person might say it was 1 page, and also say it was 18 or more pages, and therefore the length of the Uluru Statement was a live issue that was up for debate.
Such a stupid freaking live issue as well. Who gives a shit? Whether it's 1 page or 18 pages, still takes you about 5 minutes to read. Christ, we argue over some bullshit in this country.
However, a fact-checker weighed in on one side of the debate, even though there were arguments for the other side. This meant the fact-checker was really making a political decision here.
An educational institution, one that would not be subject to these new laws.
One can also see during the Voice referendum, as yet another example, the government liked to claim that the Voice was merely advisory, and it was misinformation to claim otherwise. Misinformation to claim that the Voice would be powerful. However, as I've indicated, if you look at the plain text of the amendment text, well, the Voice would have had power. It would have had power because it would be the only constitutionally enshrined body that could make representations to the government, and therefore implicitly would need to be consulted by the government. No other body would have those same rights, and therefore it would tautologically have more representation and consultation rights than any other entity, because no other entity would be enshrined in the Constitution. Therefore, it would be able to control the narrative, because other people might simply not be in the room.
Yeah, don't know if it could control the narrative, but it did have implied rights to be consulted, and therefore the ability to argue that it had not been consulted.
The Voice might be consulted, but countervailing views might be avoided or perhaps ignored because the government did not need to consult them. Furthermore, the Voice would have litigation rights, because it could allege the government had failed to consider its representations, failed to consult it in the adequate manner, and therefore it could litigate potentially vexatiously if it didn't get its way, something that Thomas Mayo had alluded to. This gives rise to indirect, implicit power. This is still power. It is not merely advisory if there is power underlying the voice. The government's talking points were clearly false, but the government would wrongly accuse people who raised questions of spreading misinformation. The other issue is that knowledge evolves over time. Things that we believed at one point to be correct might turn out to be wrong. For example, we once believed that the sun revolved around the earth. Or for example, the theory of evolution was once misinformation. There's a whole lot of things we take for granted now that were once rather contentious. However, by suppressing challenges to the status quo, this misinformation bill effectively keeps us locked in the now, and it stops information advancing.
Yeah, but we've never been a particularly innovative country anyway. We like the here and now.
Now, the government might argue that they're exempting universities from its provisions, and universities could go out and create that knowledge.
Ugh, what a crock. What a crock.
However,
someone who spent a lot of time at university, what a crock. They should be the least exempt.
Knowledge arises from myriad entities, which is something that Ed Husick, the Minister for Innovation and Industry, has himself stressed.
And so when I think of startups, I think these are the problem solvers. These are the people who do things differently. These are the people that force others to think and do things differently by virtue of what they have come up with. And what we need in the Australian economy is that dynamism. We have too many,
He's right, we do need that dynamism, but the heavy hand of the government is very, very unlikely to develop that dynamism.
Let me rephrase that. We have a few big companies. I want big firms, but we can't have the same narrow, concentrated number of firms. You inject, and the investors that back you that are here inject vital energy into our economy and to get us doing things differently. And we need to work with you to make that happen.
There are also issues with the threshold requirement that the information in question must, quote, contribute to serious harm. This is clearly an insufficient hurdle, because it doesn't need to cause the serious harm, it needs to simply contribute to it. Therefore, just repeating a piece of information that maybe were in contention,
they're getting on the bandwagon. It's a very low bar.
Would itself seemingly run afoul of this provision. Furthermore, the definition of harm is incredibly broad. It includes harm to the democratic system.
Harm means any of the following. Hatred against a group in Australian society on the basis of ethnicity, nationality, race, gender, sexual orientation, age, religion, or physical or mental disability. Wow. So the R word could fall under that category. That seems to be covered already by the Racial Discrimination Act, National Discrimination Act. Guess this is broadening those provisions. Racial Discrimination Act, 1975. Protects people from discrimination in employment, education, provision of goods, services, facilities, accommodation, sport, and administration of laws and services. Age Discrimination Act, Disability Discrimination Act, Racial Discrimination Act, Sex Discrimination Act, Australian Human Rights Commission Act. So, I guess this is where the phrase insult, intimidate, or offend comes from in our anti-discrimination policies, I believe. So it's interesting that they've replicated all of those in the Misinformation Bill. Disruption of public order or society in Australia. Again, I take you back just a couple of years to the dark times, the COVID times. Disruption of public order or society in Australia. So every one of those freedom rallies, this allows the Victorian Labor government to arrest that pregnant chick in Ballarat. This gives Victoria Police the all clear for that. because even promoting what would otherwise have been a normal, peaceful public gathering, exercising our right to protest, would also fall under disruption of public order. So that's their out for all of the heavy-handedness we saw during COVID, and not just in Victoria, to be fair, although Victoria definitely copped the worst of it. Harm to the integrity of the Australian democratic processes or of Commonwealth, state, territory or local government institutions. So that's the Donald Trump stolen election defence. Harm to the health of Australians. Better not be questioning the vaccines. Now, as someone who was vaccinated twice, I thought the vaccines were a bit of a scientific miracle, to be honest. The speed with which humanity developed a vaccine for the typical coronavirus, which had never been done before on this planet in, what, a couple of years, less, was unbelievable. And honestly, that would be among the least harmful things I've put into my body. So I was quite happy to take a couple, but I also don't think it should be forced on people, and you should absolutely be allowed to question the efficacy of medication that is brand new and unprecedented in humanity. Harm to the health of Australians could cover any doctor reporting on what those heart problems or things that came with, I think it was the Pfizer vaccine. Anything questioning that, like questioning the status quo, as he says, on vaccines, would almost certainly have come under the category of misinformation under this bill. No questions, government sources only. Harm to the Australian environment. Economic or financial harm to Australians, the Australian economy, or a sector of the Australian economy. Not sure what they have in mind for that last one when it comes to misinformation. Maybe bad stock tips?
Public order.
Again, that's not the government's job. At least I don't think it is.
Australians' financial health, the Australian economy, the environment, myriad things. It is so incredibly broad. Therefore, the government might argue that if you're going out and questioning its talking points, this might harm the democratic system. They might allege you.
And everyone's going to say that's misinformation itself, but that is a very, very real risk. Just picture the guy or girl from the party you don't like being in control of this mechanism. They're the ones responsible for the definition of public order, democratic processes, health of Australians, or financial harm. And suddenly, I think you'll find it's not as clear-cut.
Spreading misinformation and therefore harming democracy. However, this can arise even when the government itself is spreading misinformation and one is merely questioning what the...
Again, the government does not need to be exempt from this legislation. They already have parliamentary privilege, which exempts them from the libel and the defamation laws that the rest of the country is subject to. So they already have an out from any accountability for the things they say. You don't. We don't.
Government is raising. In theory, a third-party arbitrator could determine what is harmful or what is misinformation or what is false or misleading. But like I said, this relies on us trusting them to be impartial. This then leads me to the next problem, which is who is exempt from the legislation. Now, the way this works is that information provided by some entities is automatically deemed to not be misinformation, and therefore the...
It's as if they don't believe educational institutions are capable of misinformation. Information is not good simply because it's come from a human being, a person who works at an educational institution.
Social media companies don't need to take steps to verify that information, to ensure that it is accurate, to ensure that it is not false, misleading, or deceptive. Now, the exempt entities are government, media organisations, universities, and the like. What you can tell here is the government is exempting itself from its own misinformation provisions, meaning the government would then legally be able to go out and spread misinformation. And social media companies would not be obliged to go out and police that. They'd not be obliged to take down misinformation from the government, which itself is a bit troubling. After all, the government has so much more power than any other private individual and is supposed to be trustworthy that you would expect the government to be held to a higher standard, not to a lower standard.
Standard? Is that a hint of a South Australian accent I detect there, Mr. Australian Agenda? Standard? Advance? We say advance and standard down here in Victoria.
This, of course, leads to the major problem that the government has carte blanche to go out and spread misinformation itself, spread misleading talking points. But if people challenge those, well, then that's somehow perhaps caught up as misinformation because it would go against the narrative the government is trying to pursue.
It's all possible, regardless of how unlikely you might think it is. It's absolutely possible.
And the government would deem that to be misinformation. There are also problems with educational institutions being exempt. Now, historically, educational institutions were simply involved in the generation of knowledge and in research and the like. However, over time, educational institutions have become increasingly politically active. We saw this during the Voice.
We're seeing that right now with the war in Gaza. Some of the protests that are coming out of universities, not just in Australia, but all over the world, it's a little bit terrifying.
Referendum, where universities took sides in an inherently political debate.
And yeah, exactly. Student activists have always been pretty extreme. I was not an activist student. I just wanted to get in, get my bit of paper and get out.
And some divisions within those universities spread misinformation themselves. There was one institute, for example, that spread misleading information about the composition of the voice body. They indicated the voice body.
If you don't know, here you go. Tick. Cheers, Ray. Uluru Statement. What is this, Instagram or something? Twitter, maybe. 6 important facts about the voice. It will be independent from the government. It will provide advice to Parliament and the government. It will be an elected body drawn from local communities. It will have remote area representation. It will have equal numbers of women and men. You can't guarantee that if it's elected. It will not run programs or handle any funding. Also can't guarantee that. So, authorised by Jeff Scott of the Uluru Dialogue, University of New South Wales, Sydney. Well, thank the man in the sky for our politically neutral and oh so wise universities.
Would have perhaps equal gender representation. Representation from regional areas would be elected, not selected. But that was simply false because we don't know that information. Under the actual
I don't know if that makes it false. It means they certainly can't guarantee it.
Text would have gone into the Constitution. It said nothing about exactly how the voice would be comprised. This would be left up to the Parliament to determine via legislation. And this could change over time as the whims of the Parliament changed. Not only that, the government refused to put up draft legislation about the voice, and therefore we don't even know what the government intended for the voice to be.
One of Albo's bigger mistakes, and he's made a few in the last few weeks.
And therefore the talking points were simply false. But under the Misinformation Bill, those talking points would be exempt from being considered. Social media companies wouldn't need to analyse whether those were correct, false, misleading, or whatever the case might be. And that's a problem when educational institutions are becoming increasingly political.
It's more than that, it's a problem of fairness. Why on earth should Albo and his cronies and the 17 government departments full of PR people that he runs get to post whatever the hell they want on Facebook while you don't have that right? What sort of elitist could possibly think that's a fair outcome?
The news media can also spread false information, either intentionally or unintentionally. We've seen this, for example, with the myriad defamation lawsuits, some of which have been lodged against the ABC, for example. These involve people like Chow Chow Quing and
Chris Kenny,
Heston Russell, situations where the ABC lost, and clearly, therefore, where the ABC was spreading misinformation.
Oh, no dog fuckers.
Because they lost the defamation lawsuit. The government has, like I've indicated, excluded itself from the revisions, enabling it to go around spreading misinformation. This, of course, is telling. It suggests the whole thing is just a massive power grab. The third issue is the bill seemingly incentivizes overreach, and seemingly incentivizes social media companies to suppress far too much speech. The bill requires that social media companies develop a code to suppress so-called misinformation. These codes should, in theory, avoid suppressing political speech, but there are some major issues. First, the social media companies would seemingly be under no obligation to report on whether they suppress speech that is correct, that is, speech that is not false, misleading, or deceptive, according to the definition.
Yes, but that's not... I wouldn't say that that's within the scope of this sort of information. That would be more a reporting and transparency requirement rather than a misinformation requirement.
Or phrased differently, ACMA, being the regulator, could identify if or when an entity fails to suppress misinformation as it defines, but ACMA would not observe erroneous suppressions. You don't know...
Oh, they don't care about it. That just gets caught in the crossfire. And that is the chilling effect.
Know what you don't know. If the speech was suppressed, and thus...
Well, go out and find out what you don't know. You dinosaur?
Unobserved, you might not even know that it was suppressed to begin with. But social media companies would be named and shamed and penalized for failing to suppress so-called misinformation.
Which is the script flipped entirely on its head, if you think about it.
But there is no seeming penalty for suppressing too much speech. This creates a clear incentive to err toward overreach, and err toward suppressing more speech, not less.
Absolutely true. And again, that's not something I believe any government initiative can get around. If they want to keep the government off their back, they will absolutely go above and beyond and suppress more than is necessary to strictly meet the requirements of the bill. And that's where the danger comes in. And it's not something I've seen anyone on the left or any supporters of this sort of legislation, any of the propaganda model subscribers, elucidate on.
Second, while the social media companies are obliged to consider whether their codes create an undue burden on political communication, they aren't obliged to consider whether there's an undue burden on other communication, and what is an undue burden requires definition. For example, a social media company who is perhaps incentivized to engage in overreach might argue that demonetizing a channel is not an undue burden, because that channel can still go out and produce content. However, that fails to consider that by demonetizing a channel, that eliminates the person's ability to be compensated for their time and effort, and therefore pay for writers or editors or whatever the case might be as is necessary.
Yeah, I'm not sure writers and editors are covered by the concept of free speech. Just not sure about that.
For that channel. Thumbnail editors, for example, cost money. Video editors cost money. Software costs money. Computers cost money. Everything else costs money. And therefore, if you demonetize a channel...
You mean thumbnail editors cost money? You just get a picture of you doing a weird face and then whack it on some random piece of content. Not that I do even that, let's be honest.
There's no way to offset some of those costs. Now, most channels are actually making a loss. However, a way to defray that loss and slightly reduce it is through monetization. And if you demonetize a channel, then it makes these channels even less cost effective.
It's a very YouTuber-specific reading of one of the outcomes of the bill. Not that I have a problem with that. He's a YouTuber. He's absolutely within his rights to point that out. But I don't think any free speech philosophical understanding covers the idea of getting paid for your free speech.
Overall, therefore,
that's just a handy bonus. But reaching people, the ability to actually be heard in what we're now calling the public square, in Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, that is absolutely a part of it in the modern world. And if you don't believe that's the case, like I said, the analogy of the padded room where you can scream at the top of your lungs but no one else can hear you. You have free speech, but it's not worth anything at that point. It's not a principle worth defending, the ability to scream into the void. If you don't have the ability to enter the public square, then you don't really have free speech.
The Misinformation Bill is a complete disaster. It's a clear attack on free speech.
Well, we'll see if it's a disaster.
My inference is this appears to be motivated by animus towards social media commentators, particularly social media commentators that are perhaps acrimonious toward or critical of the ALP.
More specifically, social media commentators who I don't know, were publicly opposed to The Voice, were part of that torrent of misinformation and racist disinformation we've seen. I believe Albo in Parliament today brought up that crazy Jewish campaign material, i.e., flyer some weirdos printed off in his basement that labelled the whole thing as a Jewish conspiracy, and he's using that to reach much, much further beyond. It's pretty smart political play, actually, but it's just as dangerous as that crazy Jewish propaganda in the first place, if you ask me.
The bill is not salvageable. There are no redeeming features. There is no way it could be reformed into something that is in any way usable. It should simply be scrapped. It is a clear exercise in overreach. It defines misinformation far too broadly. It incentivizes social media companies to suppress more speech, not less.
Yeah, but what about?
It seemingly incentivizes overreach and seemingly incentivizes social media companies to suppress far too much speech. The bill requires that social media companies.
But what about the
Jews?
Yeah, what about the Jews? We gotta. Oh man, I don't even feel sorry for people who buy this stuff. It's just really is existing in another world. Oh, Anthony Pratt donated $1 million to the Yes campaign. Robert Mann, Stolen Generations proponent. Just like, even if you were to accept the absolute worst potential version of reality, and you were to assume that all these people are actually Jewish, I have no idea if that's the case, and that they were all deeply involved at the heart of the Voice campaign, and ... question mark. Like, how can you seriously use this as your justification to crack down on social media companies hosting normal conversations between normal people? Like I said, it's a very smart political play, because everyone looks at this and goes, oh my God, that was a part of the No campaign. We got to stop this. We got to do everything in our power to make sure this anti-Semitic, although the people protesting for Hamas probably buy into this sort of stuff, but everyone else doesn't give a shit about this. This isn't a part of their world.
The government exempts itself from its own prohibitions on misinformation, enabling the government to go out and spread incorrect talking points without people actually being able to be critical of it. This would be a clear power grab. Clearly, this bill needs to be stopped. And if you're also concerned, then probably the best way to deal with this is to vote out the people who support this at the next election.
Little campaign message for the Libs at the end there. Thank you, Australian Agenda. Whew. That was interesting. So the end result, obviously, is that government, universities, or some other media organisation gets to decide what constitutes misinformation. Not only gets to decide what constitutes misinformation, but is completely exempt from not spreading misinformation themselves. And rather than simply countering misinformation with good information, which, is exactly what things like that RMIT fact check were purporting to do in the first place, sunlight is the best disinfectant and all that, they're going to actively punish Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Kick, Rumble, Twitch, any other website that basically lets people speak amongst themselves. Obviously, those companies will then have to go in with a very heavy hand on, deleting posts, banning users, hiding content, shadow banning topics, things you might actually be looking for, which in turn, it can't not have a chilling effect on the conversations people have on these platforms. And probably the most egregious part of this whole thing is those exclusions from the standards. The ABC, universities, the Australian, Rupert Murdoch's empire, universities, the government. They can all say whatever they want on whatever platform they want, while an individual saying the same thing gets banned by Twitter or Facebook on behalf of Albo and friends. Find me an excuse for not holding the government to their own standards on this. And if the argument for the universities is that campuses need to be home for a contest of ideas, even bad ideas, that's where bad ideas need to be combated with good ideas, what possible good reason could there be for not letting everyone else join in that contest? Because as far as I can see, there's only one possible answer. And look, it's a bit of a cringe word, and I hate it, but it applies quite literally in this case, and that is elitism, because Albo and friends don't even consider themselves susceptible to misinformation. They were on the yes side. They were in the educated electorates in the inner cities, not the moron outer suburbs. They don't consider reputable organizations like universities or the ABC to have any inherent biases, despite the fact that they're made up of people like everything else. They're not susceptible to the same pushes and pulls that we regular humans are. Albone is student activist cohort. He came from student activism at uni, fighting the good fight, but everyone else is just a little bit dumber. He's the guy that says educate yourself when you're having that debate on campus. Everyone else is not quite able to interpret this sort of information, at least not without the government providing context for us. It's like he wants a hand in every conversation going on throughout the entire nation, so he can steer them in the right direction. And obviously he can't do that in the real world without a whole lot of padded rooms, but he's definitely going to try in the new online public squares. There's a lot of reasons not to trust the government. Not all of them are conspiratorial or even partisan, but maybe before I go into that, I should mention I've been watching the Cricket World Cup for the last few nights, and here is a little highlight package where the motherland, England, were ruthlessly slaughtered by their former colonial servants, South Africa. Wow. We got to give this at least a couple of minutes. This is where they really stick. Oh, video unavailable. The copyright gods got to it. Someone put up something else. No. Oh, snap. Well, that's what you get for being late to the broadcast. This gentleman slaughtered them. Oh my god. Fuck it. Oh, that's a shame. That would have been a little mood lightener. Anyway, as I was saying, while I was watching the cricket, I happened upon a couple of ads from Victoria Police. This is interesting because trust in government and public institutions generally is lower than it ever has been. So, using the long dick of the law, i.e. state police forces, to force people around to your way of thinking probably seems like a good idea from Albo's perspective. But if you, once again, go back just a couple years, it's not a long time, when information was changing daily, people were getting locked up for protests and Facebook posts, getting shot at by the government in the street. for protesting, and anyone willing to give a government of any stripe that kind of power either haven't been paying attention, or maybe they just don't have these types of conversations in the first place. Conversations worth listening to, in my opinion. So, a few recruitment ads from Victoria Police came up during the cricket. They were so feel-good and fuzzy that I thought we might juxtapose these ads with some of their most recent public enforcement activities and see if the Victorian government would find itself in some of Albo's misinformation.
Over the 30 years of being in the police force, I've had the opportunity to do some amazing things and ultimately develop my career in police solutions for our most vulnerable people in the community. I always remember the first family violence incident I went to. Because I was the junior person, I was watching my senior colleague talk to the woman who had been assaulted. I felt this little hand go against me, and I looked down and it was a 3 to 4 year old toddler. They decided to come out of the house in their pyjamas and stand next to me and hold on to me.
What a heartwarming moment.
And I keep that memory at the front of my mind in everything that I do to advance family violence responses. My inner purpose is driven by my values.
Oh, look, they're walking with a Respect Women rally. They're allowing public protest.
Respect, professionalism and inclusion. The
Professionalism and inclusion and respect.
next big challenge for me is I've come into the Assistant Commissioner role of Family Violence Command, and it's off the back of 5 years of intensive reform in how we police family violence. So I'm really looking forward to developing the next 5 years and build this response to be even better than before. When I joined Victoria Police, I wasn't thinking about career development.
But they looked after you anyway.
I was just focusing on learning the trade craft of policing. But
the trade craft of policing. Now, let's turn the clock back, 2 years? See, look at that respect. Look at that trade craft.
Converged on Melbourne's Shrine of Remembrance on the third day of anti-lockdown rallies. Victoria Police put an immediate stop to media helicopters from filming marches.
Not only could you not march at this time, you couldn't film people marching at this time as a public media organisation.
To help protect their operation.
So the long dick of the law in Australia is a very long, very big dick.
Swarmed by protesters and surrounded by police. More than 200 people were arrested in another day of unrest that centred at the Shrine of Remembrance.
The nature of those charges relate to flares, the discharge of golf balls, tap handles and batteries.
Yeah, look, the protests themselves got pretty unruly. I think there were even people pissing on the Shrine of Remembrance, which is just gross. But all that was inflamed by the police coming in and using force to prevent people from gathering in public.
Towards our police.
After a 3-hour deadlock, officers advanced, warning protesters to move on.
There's a safe passage off to my right.
By dusk, the crowds were dispersed, leaving the Shrine's
And then
CEO
we get to see him shooting at
visibly
people.
distressed in the aftermath. Earlier, Dean Lee condemned the protesters on Sky News.
Quite frankly, it's appalling. It really is appalling to think that people could come to this sacred place of reflection and protest.
Yeah, but think about the sacredness of that place where people gave their lives for freedom. Now, I wasn't at any of these protests, obviously, but if I were, I would be there thinking people died specifically so we could be free from the government, whether it's our own or a foreign national. We used to die for freedom. Now, in this time period, we're sacrificing freedom not only so we don't die, so we don't even get sick. We gave up every right we had for a little bit of safety. You know what they say about people who give up freedom or safety and what they deserve. So I think way deep down in there somewhere, there were actually people here who had nothing but respect for the reason the Anzacs went overseas and died in the first place, and maybe in some way thought they were honouring that legacy. But then, yeah, a few hours pass, the cops knock a few people down, somebody takes a leak on the back of the shrine, and oof, you're not looking too good there.
Their selfish purposes. It makes no sense and it's disgraceful.
Veterans and RSL bodies say participants disrespected ADF personnel who have lost their lives.
Any protest.
Keep in mind, they lost lives defending freedom.
Here takes away and diminishes the actions of our veterans.
I agree with the RSL, who have made very clear that the shrine is a sacred place, not a place of protest. It was quite disgusting to see those protesters at the shrine.
The participants have taken to the streets of Melbourne over 3 consecutive days, protesting the state's construction industry shutdown, vaccine mandates and lockdown.
This is... I wonder if I could find the original, which probably been removed from YouTube, but this is people running from police, charging in with assault rifles, firing pepper bullets at them for protesting.
Down restrictions.
Obviously, collective punishment dished out to a whole industry, namely the construction industry, as it's been locked down. And of course, Victorians have been subject to the longest lockdown anywhere in the world. With respect to these recent protests, firstly, I want to commend the police. It's been a very difficult task confronting these activists.
The police have been criticised after announcing media helicopters were blocked from filming protests.
The live news footage from the helicopters was being used by the protesters to identify where we were.
News helicopters.
They wanted to get away from the cops who were shooting at them.
Will now be
Why
able
ever would
to
they want to
film
do that?
protests, but cannot live stream footage within an hour of the event. Anna Rawlings, Sky News.
So not even allowed to live stream protests in Victoria. That's the result of giving the government that much power. And whether or not you think the lockdowns were justified or not, I don't think there's any question that that power holds a lot of danger for the general public when it's given to the government in the first place. I'm no anarchist, obviously. I typically think most police that aren't part of the highway patrol are in it for the right reasons. They obviously do a pretty good job now that they've got the crime wave from 10 years ago under control. We saw a number of them actually resign over the more heavy-handed things they were told to do by Daniel Andrews and his government. I think there's he's not the only one. Crystal Mitchell. Many of them, many of our finest cops sacrificed careers of more than 16 years because they were being told to do horrible things to people in order to protect a right to not get sick. I didn't know we ever had a right not to get sick. I do remember having a right to be free. But this is just one of several examples. It's pretty bold, again, to throw your career away because you don't like shooting at civilians at the Shrine of Remembrance. They're obviously not causally linked, but you got to keep stuff like this in mind every single time you hand a government in Australia a little bit more control over your life, your society, your culture, because we have 25 odd million people, 3 levels of government. There's government in every single aspect of our lives. There's far more government than population to justify it, and if you give them an inch, they'll take a 5-kilometre ring of steel around your suburban home. So don't ever sneer at my freedom protesters. I know they did some really dumb shit during COVID. I'm not defending that. But the underlying principles are sound. Oh, so that's the government's quest to stop misinformation in Australia by taking control of the flow of information on social media. I was going to dip into the latest in the Israel and Hamas conflict. 1:30 a.m. here in windy, rainy Victoria. I might just breeze through the day of rage protests and then call it a night. Cheers for stopping by.
Live fire, ambulances, smoke and stone-throwing youngsters. The West Bank is seething after the Gaza hospital disaster.
The Gaza hospital disaster that Hamas claimed was an Israeli airstrike that killed 500 people, despite it being a rocket that fell out of the sky and blew up in a car park and killed, I think it was less than 10 at last count. So the information coming out of Gaza and now the West Bank, take it all with a pretty big chunk of salt.
There's 3 days of mourning and a general strike here after a terrible week and a half in this troubled region.
This is the West Bank. Hamas doesn't have a huge presence here, but it doesn't really mean the underlying sentiment is not there. You should look at a map of settlements. I always thought the settlements were suburban expansions from the edge of Israel's narrowest point, basically just edging their way in. They're not. They are everywhere. It must be an absolute mission just to go to the shops in the West Bank.
Small groups of youngsters are taunting the Israeli defense.
Doesn't mean I'd go and do this shit, though. Probably asking to get pipped by an IDF sniper.
Forces stationed at the main military communications hub. Above them, snipers wait and watch.
This is Sky News, by the way, part of the evil right-wing Murdoch empire, telling us about the plight of the West Bank residents, because even people who work for evil right-wing world-dominant media organizations can put out some really quality journalism. As long as you take it all in context, it all can be valuable.
And every now and again, they fire. Bullets, not tear gas. Ambulance teams rush forward to pick up the latest to be shot. They're treated as quickly as possible at the scene before speeding off. There's nothing unusual about these pictures on the West Bank, but 4 youngsters were shot for throwing stones right in front of us, and we didn't stay for a very long time. It's
interesting bowlers they're using to catapult rocks over to the Israeli side of the wall. It's amazing the bit of ingenuity that's going into, I guess, building weapons for these guys.
There's so much about life here and how violence dominates everything.
Over 60 people have been killed in clashes in the last week or so on the West Bank. It's not much reported, but it is a fact, and that's something that really explains how this has changed. 60 is hardly mentioned. That's because so many are dying in Gaza and, of course, in that attack by Hamas.
The centre of Ramallah was brought to a standstill by relatively modest crowds demonstrating against events in Gaza. The West Bank has been quite quiet since the Hamas attack in southern Israel, and Hamas wanted people on the streets. The crowd paused for prayers for the people of Gaza, led by Hassan Youssef. He's a senior Hamas leader. Beyond no doubt Israel wants him. His presence will be noted. The people who gathered here have varying and differing views on the future for Palestinians. For now, they're united in condemnation of Israel.
Every 1 minute, every people dying. That's enough.
From both sides?
Yeah, both sides. American, Arabic, Gaza, Jewish, it's enough. The same. Kill here and kill here. It's enough.
Do you think it will be enough? Will peace?
Maybe. Inshallah. I wish
God
to
willing.
stop the war.
I think it's our time in the West Bank to actually stand against this apartheid, to do something about it. What's happening today is part of a struggle that has been going on for 75 years, like we said before, and this should be a continuous movement. I think this is up to the people of Palestine to solve. I don't think we should look for international solutions, because that is, like, this has not worked in the past. So it's up to us Palestinians to stand up and be like, this is not right.
The international community's diplomats are working round the clock to try to stop this volatile situation from exploding into a regional war. On the streets, they're waiting to see what happens. They aren't happy. Few, if any, in the Middle East are happy right now. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News.
Oh. At least the bit of good news, the population in the West Bank, the Palestinians in the West Bank, having had slightly better living conditions than the people in Gaza for the last 15, 20 odd years, are not as radical as Hamas and its supporters. I think a depressingly high percentage of people in Gaza are supporting Hamas more and more with all the violence. So maybe the West Bank has opportunities for solutions on its own, but I'll have to dive into that on another day. Well, this video is actually nearly 2 days old by now. So, anywho, that's all I've got to say for now. Cheers for stopping by. Cheery pip from down under. I'll be back in a few days. Till then.